My name is Eleanor Calloway. I am 68 years old, and I would learn, though not for 6 more weeks, that the son I raised alone through his father's first heart attack had already signed away my independence before I'd even stopped wearing black. I didn't know it yet, sitting at my kitchen table that first week. I only knew that I was tired in a way sleep couldn't touch, and grateful, so grateful, that my boy had come to take some of the weight off my shoulders. Walter and I built Calloway and Sons Construction from nothing but a 3-man crew and a cement mixer he bought secondhand from a man who was going bankrupt building swimming pools. That was 1984. I kept the books at our kitchen table back then, the same table I sit at now, and Walter used to stand behind me while I balanced the accounts, tapping his finger on whatever invoice looked the least bit crooked. "Trust, but verify the invoice, Ellie," he'd say, and kiss the top of my head, and go back out to the yard smelling like fresh-cut lumber and diesel. We grew slow, the way honest things grow. By the time our son Bradley was born, we had 11 employees. By the time he graduated from Washington State with his construction management degree, we had 40, and a reputation across 3 counties for finishing what we started, on time and on budget, no shortcuts. Walter had his first heart attack the year Bradley turned 30. A mild one, the doctor said, a warning. Bradley stepped in then too, just for a few months, just until his father regained his strength. I remember being so proud of him. I remember thinking, this is what it looks like when you raise a good man. Walter's second heart attack came 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, in the framing yard behind our house, standing exactly where he always stood to watch the crews load lumber onto the trucks. He was gone before the ambulance turned onto our street. I have not moved his reading glasses since. They sit on his nightstand exactly the way he left them that morning, folded closed, one arm crossed neatly over the other, waiting for a man who is never coming back to pick them up again. I know how that sounds. I know grief is supposed to have a shape you can eventually set down. Mine hadn't found that shape yet. Some nights I still reached for his side of the bed before I remembered. Bradley came to the house the morning after the funeral, still in his black suit, dark circles under his eyes that matched my own. He sat across from me at that same kitchen table, in the chair his father used to sit in, and took my hand. "Mom," he said, "let me handle this. You shouldn't have to think about any of this right now." I thought, at the time, that those were the kindest words anyone had said to me in 6 weeks. What followed was a blur I am ashamed, now, to admit I let myself get lost in. Insurance paperwork, beneficiary forms, a stack of documents Bradley described, again and again, as just standard. The transfer of Walter's shares in the company, updates to our joint accounts, something he called a guardianship helper form that he said would simply let him assist me with day-to-day banking while I found my footing again. "You've done enough worrying for one lifetime," he told me, sliding papers across the table with sticky flags marking where to sign, the way he used to do with contractor bids when he was still a boy shadowing his father in the office. "Let me carry this one." I did not read those pages closely. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where I was simply a victim of someone else's cunning is not entirely true. I was exhausted. I was grieving. I had just buried the only man I had loved for 41 years, and my son's voice sounded exactly like safety. I signed where the flags told me to sign. My wedding ring had gone loose on my finger by then. I'd lost weight without noticing, the way grief takes things from you quietly, a few ounces at a time. I remember turning it around and around with my thumb while Bradley gathered up the papers, watching my son's steady hands doing something I assumed was an act of love. "That's the last of it," he said, tapping the stack straight against the table. "You don't have to think about any of this again. I've got it." I believed him completely. I want you to understand what that trust was built on, because it matters for everything that came after. Bradley was not, in that moment, a stranger performing kindness. He was a boy I had rocked to sleep in a house we built with our own hands. He had sat beside his father's hospital bed at 17 and again at 30, and both times, when it mattered, he had shown up. I had no reason, sitting at that table with my ring turning loose around my finger, to imagine that the papers under his hand were anything other than exactly what he told me they were. I did not know, that morning, that one of those pages carried a notary's seal from a woman who did not exist, dated 3 days before Walter's own funeral. A date that meant on paper I had granted my son legal authority over my affairs before I had even finished grieving enough to know what I was signing away. I did not know that guardianship helper was not a real legal term, a phrase Bradley had chosen specifically because it sounded gentle enough that a heartbroken woman would never ask a lawyer what it actually meant. And I did not know that 6 weeks later, a home health aide hired to help me settle in would be the one to look me in the eye and tell me that nothing my son had promised me was true. That morning, all I knew was that my son had come home to take care of me, the way I had always hoped he would. I looked at Walter's reading glasses on the nightstand through the open bedroom door, still folded, still waiting, and I thought, foolishly, gratefully, that at least I wasn't facing any of this alone. I did not know, that morning, that one of those pages carried a notary's seal from a woman who did not exist. I only knew that my son had come home to take care of me, and that at least I wasn't facing any of this alone. It was Bradley's idea that I move. "The house is too much house for one person, Mom," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands in his pockets, the way Walter used to stand when he was about to tell me something he'd already decided. The stairs, the yard, all of it. I built that guest house behind mine for exactly this, just until you're back on your feet. I looked around at rooms Walter and I had filled for 4 decades. The dining room table, where we'd hosted every Thanksgiving since 1991. The hallway with his height marked in pencil on the doorframe when he was still shorter than me. And I understood, with a tired kind of clarity, that I did not want to rattle around inside all that emptiness by myself, just until I'm back on my feet. I repeated, and I let myself believe that meant weeks, not something more permanent than that. The guest house was lovely, I'll admit. Bradley had renovated it 2 summers ago for what he called eventual rental income, though it had sat empty until now. New hardwood floors, a little stone patio, a kitchen with better appliances than the one I'd cooked in for 30 years. It was 50 yards from Bradley's own back door. Close enough, he said, that I'd never have to feel alone again. I didn't at first. That was the strange part. For 2 weeks, it felt almost like healing. Then the small thing started. My mail stopped arriving at my new address altogether. Bradley explained, reasonably, that he'd had everything forwarded to his house, so nothing gets lost in the shuffle. Insurance letters, the accountant's correspondence, anything with the company letterhead. He'd bring me the personal cards, the sympathy notes that were still trickling in 6 weeks after the funeral, and keep the rest, so I wouldn't have to think about any of it. "You've done enough worrying for one lifetime, Mom," he told me one evening, dropping off a stack of cards and nothing else. "Let me carry this one." I let him carry it. I had promised myself, hadn't I, in that first week, that I would let my son shoulder some of the weight. It felt like exactly what a good son should do, and I was so tired of being the only adult left holding anything. Our joint banking, he explained a week later, had been simplified. A new account, easier for him to manage the household bills and my expenses in one place while I settled in. He showed me the paperwork on his phone screen, scrolling too quickly for me to read any single line all the way through, and I signed a card at the bank without asking to see the account in writing first. Twice in the next 3 weeks, Bradley flew out of town for what he called site visits. New commercial contracts, he said. Out-of-state opportunities the company hadn't pursued before. I didn't think much of it. Callaway and Sons had bid on out-of-state work before, back when Walter was still alive. It wasn't strange for the company to chase a contract 3 states over. What was strange, though I didn't yet have a name for the strangeness, was the sound of his car in the driveway some nights well past midnight, the headlights sweeping across my new bedroom ceiling from a site visit that was supposed to have kept him in Boise until morning. Bradley had hired someone to help me settle in, a home health aide named Marisol Reyes, a quiet, careful woman in her 30s, who showed up 3 mornings a week to help with groceries, prescriptions, whatever I needed. I liked her immediately. She had a way of double-checking the dates on my pill bottles before handing them to me, turning each one in the light, reading the label twice. It made me feel, oddly, safer than I had in weeks. It was Marisol who found the birthday card. She was organizing a folder of documents Bradley had dropped off for me to sign, routine things. He'd said on the phone, "Don't worry about reading them line by line. Just sign where I flagged it, when a small envelope slipped out from between two pages and landed on the kitchen table. A child's handwriting, uneven letters, a crayon drawing of what might have been a dog or might have been a bear. Happy birthday, Dad. Love, Tyler. I picked it up and turned it over twice. The way you turn over something that doesn't fit the shape of what you already know. Tyler, I said out loud, to no one in particular. I don't know a Tyler. Marisol went very still beside me. I remember that stillness more clearly than almost anything else from those weeks. The way her hands stopped moving over the folder. The way she didn't quite look at me. Maybe it's a client's child, I said. Bradley works with a lot of families. I said it the way you say things you want someone to agree with quickly, so you can stop thinking about them. Marisol didn't agree with me quickly. She didn't agree with me at all. Mrs. Calloway, she said instead, and her voice had gone careful in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Can I ask you something? Of course. When your husband passed, did you ever meet with a lawyer yourself? Just you alone, without Bradley in the room? The question landed strangely, sideways, like a door I hadn't noticed was ajar. Bradley handled all of that, I said. He said it would be easier, less for me to carry. Marisol set the folder down on the table very slowly, the way you set down something you're afraid might go off. I don't think your son ever filed those power of attorney papers the way he told you he did, she said. I heard the words. I understood every one of them individually, but strung together in my own kitchen, from a woman I had known for 3 weeks. They refused to arrange themselves into anything I could accept as true. Bradley wouldn't, I started to say. And then I stopped, because I was holding a birthday card addressed to my son from a child named Tyler that I had never once heard mentioned in 29 years of being his mother, and some small, cold part of me had already begun doing the arithmetic I didn't want to finish. I was holding a birthday card addressed to my son from a child named Tyler that I had never once heard mentioned in 29 years of being his mother, and some small, cold part of me had already begun doing the arithmetic I didn't want to finish. I did not confront Bradley that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't restraint, exactly, and it wasn't wisdom. It was fear, a plain, ordinary fear that if I said the wrong thing to the wrong son at the wrong moment, I would lose whatever version of my family I still had left. Instead, I asked to see my own paperwork. I asked casually, over dinner, the way you ask about the weather. I'd like copies of everything I've signed since the funeral, Bradley, just for my own records. He smiled at me the way he used to smile at difficult clients. Of course, Mom. I'll pull it together this week. A week passed. Then another. Each time I asked, there was a reason. The accountant had the originals. His assistant was scanning them. He'd bring them by Sunday, and then Sunday came and went without an envelope in his hands. What I didn't know, that week, was that Marisol had already done what I was too afraid to do. She told me on a Thursday morning, in my kitchen, with the kettle ticking on the stove between us. She'd photographed the folder of documents days earlier, she said, back before the birthday card had even fallen out onto the table. A habit, she admitted, from a previous job where a family had accused her, falsely, of mishandling paperwork. She protected herself now. Always. With everyone. There's a signature on the power of attorney, she said, sliding her phone across the counter to me. Dated 3 days before Mr. Calloway's funeral. I looked at the date on the screen. Then I looked at it again. The way you look at a number that refuses to rearrange itself into something that makes sense. That's not possible, I said. Walter was still alive. I know, Marisol said. That's what I mean. I sat down slowly at my own kitchen table, in the chair that used to be Walter's, and I thought about how a signature with my name on it could exist on a date when I had still been 3 days away from becoming a widow. I didn't want to believe it either, Mrs. Calloway, Marisol said, and her voice had gone soft in a way I hadn't heard from her before. My own mother went through something like this, with my stepfather, years ago. That's part of why I couldn't stay quiet. I know what it looks like when it's already started. I did not cry. I remember being surprised by that, distantly. The way you're surprised by your own calm in the middle of an emergency. Some part of me had already begun preparing for what I might have to do next, long before the rest of me caught up. Bradley left for another site visit That Saturday, Boise again, he said. A promising commercial bid. Back Tuesday at the latest. I watched his car pull out of the driveway from my kitchen window. Taillights disappearing down the road. He'd driven 1,000 times as a boy on his bicycle, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the sound of a door quietly closing. He'd left his laptop in the guest house. He'd forgotten it, or he hadn't thought I would ever need a reason to open it. Sitting closed on the little desk by the window, still faintly warm from wherever he'd had it last. I stood over it for a long moment before I touched it. I want you to understand that this was not a decision I made lightly. 41 years of marriage had taught me the difference between privacy and secrecy, and some instinct told me this had crossed into the second one a long time ago. Marisol stood beside me while I opened it. I don't think either of us said a word. The flight records were the first thing I found. Boise, Idaho. 6 trips in the last 4 months alone. Always booked for 2 passengers, never one. A hotel confirmation. The Grove Hotel downtown. A room with 2 queen beds. A key card, still tucked into the laptop side pocket, for a room in a city 3 hours from where I sat. And then, in a folder labeled Simply Family, a photograph. A woman I had never met, dark-haired, maybe 35, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize with her arm around 2 children. A younger girl, maybe 6, and an older boy, perhaps 9, holding a school portrait like the one still tucked in a frame on a shelf somewhere, signed in the same uneven crayon handwriting I had already seen once before. Love, Tyler. I turned the photograph over in my hands, again and again, looking, I am ashamed to admit, for some resemblance to Walter in that boy's face. Some proof that this wasn't real, that I had misunderstood something simple and forgivable. I found only my son's jaw, my son's eyes. Tyler, I whispered, to no one, to the empty guest house, to a photograph of a family I hadn't known existed for however many years it had taken to build one. Marisol didn't say anything. She just put her hand over mine, steady, the way you steady something that's shaking without drawing attention to the fact that it is. That night, alone in the guest house after she'd gone home, I picked up Walter's reading glasses from the nightstand for the first time since I'd moved them there 6 weeks ago. I held them the way you hold something that used to mean safety. I thought, for the first time since the funeral, how badly I wanted to ask him what to do next. What a construction company built on 40 years of honest invoices was supposed to do with a son who had learned, somewhere along the way, that lies could be framed and hung on a wall like anything else worth keeping. I did not know, holding those glasses in the dark, that the second family in that photograph was only the beginning of what Bradley had built without me. I did not know about the equipment fleet, or the loan documents, or how long the company Walter and I had spent 4 decades protecting had already been quietly bleeding for a life I had never been told about. All I knew was that my son was 3 hours away in Boise, Idaho, sleeping in a house I had just discovered existed, and that when he came home Tuesday, he would have no idea how much I already knew. All I knew was that my son was 3 hours away in Boise, Idaho, sleeping in a house I had just discovered existed, and that when he came home Tuesday, he would have no idea how much I already knew. I did not confront him when he walked through my door that Tuesday evening, tanned and cheerful, carrying a box of chocolates from the airport gift shop like a man who'd simply been away on business. I took the chocolates. I thanked him. I asked about his flight. I have thought about that decision many times since. Whether it was cowardice or strategy, I still can't say for certain. What I knew, standing in my own kitchen, holding a box of drugstore chocolates for my son's second life, was that screaming at him would accomplish nothing except giving him time to prepare his answers. I needed someone who already knew what real paperwork looked like. I called Harold Ean the next morning. Harold had been Walter's attorney for 31 years, since before Bradley was born, since the company was still just Walter and 2 other men, and that second-hand cement mixer. He'd handled the incorporation papers, the union contracts, every legal headache the business had ever produced, and he still wrote to me on the same cream-colored stationery with the university crest in the corner that his firm had used since 1993. I remembered Walter joking once that Harold's letterhead had outlasted 3 of his own secretaries. "Eleanor," Harold said when I called. His voice hadn't changed in 3 decades. Steady, unhurried. the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be believed. I heard about Walter. I'm so sorry I couldn't make the service. I was in Seattle. Harold, I need you to look at something for me, I said. It's about Bradley. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, the kind of pause a good lawyer allows himself before he commits to hearing something he suspects he won't like. Send it over, he said. I photographed the power of attorney document myself that afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table with Marisol beside me for support, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. I emailed the pages to Harold before I could talk myself out of it. He called back the following morning. I remember exactly where I was standing, by the window, looking out at the framing yard where Walter used to watch the crews load lumber, the smell of cut pine drifting up from somewhere even now, months after his death, as though the wood itself refused to let him go. Eleanor, Harold said, and there was no warmth left in the word this time, only precision. This document was never legal. Not for one single day. I closed my eyes. Tell me. The notary's seal on page 3 belongs to a license number that doesn't exist in the state database. I checked twice. And the date, Eleanor. This thing is dated 3 days before Walter's funeral. You couldn't have granted power of attorney over your own affairs on a date when your husband was still, according to every record I can find, alive and signing his own paychecks. I know, I said. I already knew that part. Then you know what this means. I did know. I had known, in some quiet, unexamined corner of myself, since the moment Marisol's phone had shown me that impossible date on her kitchen counter screen. Knowing it from Harold, though, hearing it stated as legal fact by a man who had spent 31 years being careful with exactly these kinds of words, made it real in a way that felt like standing on solid ground for the first time in weeks. I have to report this, Harold said. Not just for you. For the company. If this document has been used to authorize transactions, transfers, anything at all touching Callaway and Sons, we're looking at fraud against a vulnerable adult, and possibly against the business itself. I need to bring in the Attorney General's Financial Fraud Unit. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. Do it, I said. It took the state investigators 4 days to schedule an interview with Bradley. I was not in the room when it happened. I only learned the details afterward, secondhand, from a young detective named Reyes, no relation to Marisol, who called me herself once the interview concluded, her voice careful in the particular way of someone delivering news she suspected would hurt. Bradley had been calm at first, she told me, composed. He explained that the power of attorney had been drawn up quickly, in the chaos after his father's death, to help ease his mother's burden during an impossibly difficult time. Standard family arrangement, he said. Nothing unusual. Then Detective Reyes had asked him a simple question. Had the joint bank account transfers, the ones moving funds out of Eleanor's accounts and into an account associated with a property in Boise, ever been disclosed to the bank as being made under a legally authorized power of attorney? I told the bank everything was authorized, Bradley said. Ask them. They can confirm it. It took the detectives less than an hour to confirm the opposite. The bank had no record of any authorization conversation, no signed disclosure form, nothing beyond the joint account paperwork Bradley himself had walked his mother through at her kitchen table weeks earlier. Paperwork that had never once mentioned the words power of attorney, because at the time it was created, Bradley had not yet needed that particular lie. He had told 2 different institutions 2 different stories, weeks apart, and forgotten, in his confidence, that both stories would eventually land on the same desk. Detective Reyes told me this part gently. The way you tell a mother something you know will cost her. He got flustered when we pointed out the discrepancy, Mrs. Callaway. He said something about how none of this was supposed to matter, how it was only meant to be temporary. And then he stopped talking and asked for an attorney. I sat with that phrase for a long time after we hung up. Only meant to be temporary. As though stealing from your own grieving mother came with an expiration date, a plan to make it right again before anyone noticed it had ever happened. I did not yet know, that week, how far back the temporary arrangement actually went. I did not know about the equipment fleet, quietly used as collateral for a loan I had never signed for and never seen. I did not know that the woman in Boise had been part of Bradley's life for the better part of 4 years, or that the money funding her house, Her children's school, the flights and hotel rooms and birthday gifts had been bleeding out of the company Walter, and I built one invoice at a time, long before Walter had even had his second heart attack. All I knew, standing at my kitchen window, with Harold's confirmation still ringing in my ears, was that the son who told me to let him carry the weight had been carrying something else entirely. A second life, built quietly on the foundation of the first one, and that whatever came next would determine whether anything of what Walter and I had built could still be called ours. Walking away from instead, and rebuilding trust, I've come to understand, was never about forgiving what happened in that guest house. It was about deciding, deliberately, slowly, one honest choice at a time, who gets to hold my name again. I still keep the framing yard mode, though the trucks that once loaded lumber there belong to other men now. Some mornings I stand out there with my coffee and breathe in the smell of cut pine, and I think about a young man with a second-hand cement mixer, and a woman keeping his books at a kitchen table by lamplight, and how far too honest people built something before anyone thought to ask what honesty was actually worth. It was worth everything, in the end, just not to everyone I thought it would be.